In July 2011, a quiet neighborhood in Delaware, United States, witnessed an extraordinary reunion nearly 4 decades in the making.
Brother Ed, hi!
The woman was a legend in South Korea. The man was a retired American veteran. When they finally locked eyes, the world seemed to stop. Her name is Insuni, a Korean-American mixed-race woman. You've probably never heard of her, but in South Korea, she's a true diva. Think of her as Korea's Tina Turner, not just an incredible singer, but someone who, in a deeply conservative era, broke through as a mixed-race woman. You'd normally only see someone like her at a red carpet event or under the bright lights of some TV studio. But on this day, she wasn't at a gala, wasn't doing a concert. She was standing on a sidewalk in Wilmington, Delaware, just a quiet neighborhood. She was there for one person, a 58-year-old retired veteran named Ronald Lewis. And the second she saw him, she completely broke down. Neighbors watching from their porches were completely baffled. For decades, nothing major ever really happened on this quiet street. It was just Ronald, their friendly neighbor. But suddenly, there are news cameras everywhere, and this elegant woman steps out of a car and just collapses into his arms, sobbing like her heart is breaking. They had no idea who she was or why she was so emotional. All they knew was that something extraordinary was happening right in front of them. To understand why, we need to go back to 1954. Most of us don't really remember that time. I don't either. But back then, it was an era still shrouded in the ashes of war. The fighting in the Korean War had just been paused. The shooting had stopped, but thousands of U.S. soldiers were still stationed there, indefinitely. And with all these soldiers staying in Korea, a lot of them had relationships with Korean women, which meant a lot of mixed-race children were born. This is where Insuni's story begins. 1957. She was born to a Korean mother and an American soldier she would never meet. Back then, schools openly taught children to take pride in racial purity. In that intensely exclusive society, being mixed race was a mark of marginalization. You were branded, an outcast from day one. Growing up as a mixed-race kid in 1960s South Korea? It wasn't just hard, it was brutal. Insuni's appearance made it impossible to blend in. The darker skin, everyone could tell immediately that she was different. And in a society that prized conformity and pure blood, different meant outcast. She later wrote about her school days. "The thing I feared most was standing in front of people." Just think about that for a second. A child so used to being stared at, mocked, that the simple act of being visible terrified her. Her classmate remembered those years clearly. Insuni was constantly targeted by male students, discriminated against, verbally abused, day after day. Eventually, she was kicked out of school. Between the discrimination and her family's poverty, high school was never an option. And that became one of her deepest regrets. She desperately wanted to keep studying. Because kids from poor families, they understand better than anyone that education is the only way out, the only path to a different life. But for her back then, that door was slammed shut. She never forgot that feeling. And maybe that's why, in 2013, she founded the Hae Mill School outside of Seoul, a place that offers free tuition for biracial students, ensuring that for them, the door stays open. Her mother, though, never gave up on her, never complained. She just kept reassuring her, kept holding things together, working odd jobs wherever she could find them, doing whatever it took to keep them alive. Then, in 1972, something happened that would change everything. A 19-year-old American GI named Ronald Lewis had just arrived at the base near her village. He was still getting his bearings in this completely foreign place. Everything was unfamiliar. One day, he was leaving the base when he saw her, this teenage girl sitting alone on the side of the road. No one around her, no one talking to her, just by herself. He walked over and asked what was going on. She told him her story. And something in Ronald just shifted. He felt terrible for her, this kid who'd done nothing wrong except exist. So he went out and bought her new clothes. When he gave them to her, she couldn't stop smiling. Because in her entire life, she'd never owned anything that was actually hers. Everything she'd ever worn had been someone else's leftovers. But Ronald didn't stop there. He learned that she'd never left her small town, never seen anything beyond the village where she was born. So over the next 3 years, whenever he had leave, he'd take her out, show her the country, different cities, different places, different sights. For 3 years, they traveled all over Korea together. Ronald took her everywhere. He showed her the world outside that small, suffocating village. But he gave her so much more than just a change of scenery. He gave her courage. He gave her a sense of warmth that she had never known before. It was the kind of warmth that would stay with her for the rest of her life. It became a light she could carry into the darkest moments of her career. In many ways, those 3 years with Ronald were what finally began to heal the deep, painful scars of her childhood. He showed her that she wasn't an outcast. She was a human being who deserved to be seen. Ronald captured all those 3 years through his camera. Every moment, every place they visited, he photographed it all. By 1975, his tour in Korea was officially over. He didn't want to leave, but he had no choice. He packed up and headed back to the States. At first, they stayed in touch, sharing bits of their lives, sending letters back and forth. But remember, this was decades before the internet, before cell phones. If a letter gets lost in the mail, or if someone moves just once, that's it. The connection's gone. They lost contact. Ronald took all those photographs and had them developed into an album. Whenever he missed Korea, missed Insuni, he'd pull it out and flip through the pages. Years later, he said he'd dream about her, regularly. Every few months, she'd show up in his dreams. But Insuni, she never stopped moving. Over the next 4 decades, she fought her way to the top of the Korean music industry. And I mean fought. Every time she stepped on stage, she was still that mixed-race girl in a society that wasn't always ready for her. She had to work twice as hard, sing twice as loud. She became a legend. But even with all that success, there was this gap in her story. She never forgot that young soldier who bought her those first clothes and showed her she mattered. She started performing for the U.S. military, not just for the gigs, but because she hoped maybe someone could help her find him. Finally, in 2011, she's performing for the 2nd Infantry Division. When the show ended, she didn't go to some VIP lounge. She went straight to General Tucker. "I'm looking for someone," she told him. "Ronald Lewis. He changed my life. Can you help me find him?" And it worked. A few months later, Ronald's sitting at home, opens Facebook, and there's a message waiting. It said, "Someone in Korea has been looking for you for a very long time." When Ronald first got that message on Facebook, he was stunned. For nearly 4 decades, he'd been carrying around this quiet worry. He told people later that he'd always been anxious about that girl. He kept picturing her as that 15-year-old on the roadside, and he was terrified that in a society as tough as that, she might have ended up on the streets. Hearing that she was not only okay, but thriving, it felt like this huge weight just lifted. Then came the day. Ronald is standing on his front porch in Delaware. He isn't that 19-year-old kid anymore. His hair is gray, and you can see the years in the lines on his face. But as he stands there waiting, he still has that military posture, back straight, shoulders squared, a retired soldier waiting for a guest of honor. Then, a car pulls up. The door opens, and Insuni steps out. And the second she sees him, the instant their eyes meet, it's like all those years of being a global superstar just evaporated. She isn't a legend in that moment. She's just that young girl again. She runs to him and collapses into his arms, sobbing so hard she can barely breathe. Ronald is holding her, and even though he's shocked, he's holding her just as tight. She didn't fly halfway around the world to show off her gold records or her money. She looked at him through the tears. "I wanted you to see me. I wanted you to know that because you didn't give up on me, I didn't give up on myself." And then, right there in that quiet neighborhood, she did something only she could do. She began to sing.
Was blind, but now I see.
She had written a song specifically for Ronald, a tribute to the man who changed her life decades ago. There were no microphones, no stage lights, just her voice. She sang every note for him. She also showed him a photo of her daughter, a girl who had graduated from Stanford. The ultimate proof that the cycle of poverty and exclusion was finally broken. Then Ronald brought out something he'd been keeping safe for all these years: the photo album. The pages had yellowed with time, but every picture was still there, proof of their friendship, proof of those 3 years they had together. They sat down and went through it slowly, page by page, memory by memory. They stayed like that for a long time, just remembering. You know, we often think we need to do something massive to change the world. But Ronald Lewis? He just bought a lonely kid some clothes and showed her a bit of the world. He didn't know he was saving a legend. He just thought he was helping a friend.